Hi, I'm Boy, and I'm an entrepreneur from Soweto. Soweto's come a long way, from a small township to a mini city of its own. Soweto's got some really nice suburbs, like Diepkloof Extension, but the locals call it Diepkloof Expensive. Orlando is known as the suburb that had the first brick houses built in Soweto. Orlando Stadium for its iconic games between Kaizer Chiefs and Pirates. And most importantly, Vilakazi Street, where Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu resided. To the west of Soweto, you find suburbs of Dobsonville and Protea. These two suburbs are actually very cosmopolitan, fresh, young, and very new. Right next door to Soweto, we have a neighboring suburb, which is Eldorado Park. For a little adventure and a little fun, Soweto's got so many night spots, from the News Cafe at Mamponya Mall, to your Vilakazi Streets at Kumzi's, to just chilling at Chafpozi just between the towers and having a simple braai vleis chisenyama. Something very close to my heart is actually seeing people move back into Soweto, growing businesses, remodeling homes. It merely says to us that Soweto is a growing city. There's way more to this place than what we think. Soweto needs to be discovered daily. I'm so proud to call Soweto my home, and this is my neighborhood.
Good evening and welcome to episode 42 of the Private Property Podcast. I'm your host, Zama. It's a Tuesday, and for the first time, we're coming live to you, not just from Facebook, but also from YouTube. So good evening to all our YouTube videos. Of course, we always running competitions right here on the Private Property Podcast. Last week, it was to subscribe to our YouTube channel. So we know we've got thousands of new followers who are following us on that channel. But this week, we want to hear all about your property dreams and ambitions. All you need to do is send those details right here below. You know, what are you aspiring to? Maybe you want to move out of home and finally move into that rental property or buy your first property, or perhaps you want to expand your property portfolio and add on additional properties. Whatever your property ambitions are, send them through and you stand a chance of winning one of two 1,000 Rand prizes. And of course, we'll be announcing those winners on our show on Friday evening. But to get to today's show, we're going to be talking legal matters. And I'm sure, you know, if you've ever bought a property, you have definitely encountered this. Heck, you've even encountered it if you've, rented a property. And that's, of course, the issue of the deposit. On this evening's show, we're going to be looking at understanding how attorneys manage a property's buyer's deposit. And I think a lot of us tend to struggle. I know I was quite intimidated very early on in my property journey, not knowing, who do I even transfer some of this money to? Where does it go? Is it safe? All these questions are some of the questions that we're going to be answering. And if you have any questions or comments on, how your deposit gets handled, perhaps you've once had an instance where it didn't go too great. Maybe they ran out with your money, or you were very confused about, where it goes. Do send those through, and do send rather those questions through, and we will be addressing them. And to help us better understand these legal matters, which are always, of course, quite difficult for those of us who didn't go to law school, I'm joined by Marike Elhers, who is a conveyancer and notary public from SSLR Incorporated. Good evening, Marike. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Hi, Zama. Thank you so much for having me.
So I think, and we're talking a little bit, before we went online, is that the deposit is one of those sometimes contentious things. And not because, it doesn't aid in the buying of the property. Of course, we all know that it does. And it's quite a big part of us buying our first property. But oftentimes, certainly as a buyer, you sometimes, think, wait, where am I paying this, this amount to? Is it even safe wherever it's being bought? I mean, wherever I'm paying it to. Let's perhaps start with who even appoints the attorneys that handle a transaction, because I think that's probably a good starting point. When we have a buyer and a seller, we know that there are going to be, attorneys involved. We've already spoken right here on the Private Property podcast that oftentimes when you buy certainly a property that's going to be bonded, you're going to have your transferring attorneys, and you're also going to have your bond registration attorneys. And the bond registration attorneys are appointed by the bank. The transferring attorneys are appointed by the seller. So perhaps let's look at what exactly those transferring attorneys do, Marike.
You're 100% right, Zama. So in normal circumstances, your seller would appoint the transferring attorneys. It depends. It can be varied by the agreement of sale, the offer to purchase. In some instances, your purchaser can approach your seller and say, but listen, let us change the terms. I want to appoint my attorney for ABC reasons. Whether it be a discount that he is getting or he knows the attorney himself. But you're 100% right. Normally, it's the seller who appoints the transferring attorney. And then, obviously, when your purchaser goes to the bank appoints a bond registration attorney who's on their panel. And there's, in most instances, always a third attorney being appointed. And that's in the instance where your seller has a bond registered over the property that's being sold. Then that property needs to be cancelled, and again, the bank will appoint another attorney on their panel. So at the end of it, you'll be sitting with three attorneys: your transferring attorney, your bond attorney, and your bond cancellation attorney. But the transferring attorney is the center point of the whole transaction. That's actually the attorney that will receive your deposit.
And what exactly does the transferring attorney do? I think we mustn't take it for granted that certainly when we're buying our first homes for the first time, we necessarily understand. I've actually once confessed, Marike, right here on the show in the earlier episodes, that when I bought my first property, I was buying two properties at the same time. And I hadn't done adequate research, or certainly as I was doing my research, I wasn't aware that I was going to have two attorneys per property. So I thought there's only one attorney. I only budgeted for two attorneys because I was buying two properties. And so the first invoice, pro forma invoice comes in, the second pro forma invoice comes in, and then I check my inbox, a third pro forma invoice comes in. And when that third one came in, I was thinking, okay, who is this coming from? I don't know these attorneys. I literally had to get on the phone and ask, okay, I don't understand who you guys are. I've already gotten two invoices. I'm about to settle them. So who are you guys? And luckily, I got a really great conveyancer who explained that, listen, I mean, you're buying from, the bank, so there's going to be a bond registration attorney and the transferring attorney per property. So in essence, I was going to be paying 4 different attorneys for, buying those 2 properties. And I can just imagine how overwhelming, a mistake like that typically is. But certainly as a lot of newbie buyers, we tend to not know these things. So what exactly does the transferring attorney do? You were saying that they're quite central in, the transaction, whether there's one that still needs to be canceled, a new bond that needs to be registered. Because sometimes when you buy a property for cash, for example, you're not going to have a bond registration attorney. And especially if you're buying a property, let's say that's also not bonded, so you're also not going to have the bond cancellation attorney, but you're always going to have that the transferring attorneys. What exactly is it that they do?
So you're 100% right. The transferring attorney is the central point. They will always have contact with both your seller and your purchaser. They also represent both parties in a transaction. So your transferring attorney would first receive the offer to purchase, and then he would go through it to see what the terms are. Would there be a deposit payable? Would there be a bond? Should the purchaser pay 100% cash? Is it a cash sale? You would then run through the whole transaction, get the clearance figures, get the levy figures, if it's a sectional title property or if the property falls into a homeowners association. He would then also apply for the transfer duty receipt from SARS. But while doing all of this, he links with the bond attorney and the bond cancellation attorney. He keeps them up to date with where he or she is in their transaction. But he runs the whole transferring of the property from your seller to your buyer. And in the end, then he would need to pay out the money received from the bank, because there would be guarantees issued by the bond attorneys. All the money would come into the transferring attorney's account. On registration, the transferring attorney does the final accounts, and he also does the payout to the seller and the buyer.
And so then let's look at which point we're putting in that money and where it goes. I mean, one of the things certainly with a lot of transactions, you'd find that you found the place you've been viewing for quite a couple of months, and you finally found the property that you want to buy. You've signed that OTP, and you've written down that you're going to put down that 10% deposit. And before you even go looking for bond finance, and let's assume this is somebody who hasn't been pre-qualified, so doesn't even really have a sense of how much they qualify for, but they've now signed on the dotted line and they said they're going to pay that 10% deposit. And we're saying this off air, that sometimes as early as within 3 days of signing that OTP, they'll then pay over the deposit to the transferring attorney as they go find that bank finance. What happens to this money?
Okay, so you're right again. I mean, quite a lot actually. It depends on what your offer to purchase say. In some instances, it would say that the deposit is payable on the day that it's signed or within 3 days after signature, or it can be a bit longer, 7 or 21 days. But normally it's paid quite quickly, the deposit, even before your purchaser applies for a bond. Your transferring attorney then receives the deposit. We are governed by the Legal Practitioners Act. And in terms of this act, Section 86 specifically governs this. It stipulates that a conveyancer, who's now the legal practitioner doing the transfer, the conveyancer needs to receive this money into trust. So first point is we have to have a trust account. Then when the deposit is received, you will have to determine whether you need to invest this deposit or you do not invest the deposit. This is then regulated by sections 86, 2, 3, and 4. But that would then be determined by the OTP again. So we always go back to the offer to purchase. We receive that money firstly into trust. Then we look at the offer to purchase. Most offers to purchase would say that the deposit should be invested in an interest-bearing account for the benefit of the purchaser, because it remains his money up until the day of registration. So the attorney firm then opens an investment account with a bank. It can be the same bank where his trust account is opened, or it can be another bank, just as long as that bank has an arrangement with the Fidelity Fund, the Legal Practitioners Fidelity Fund. But we'll get back to the fund once we get to whether your attorney can run away with your money or not.
Yes.
But so we receive it into trust, the conveyancer then invests it. So if let's say the offer to purchase says that you should not invest it for the interest of the purchaser. That can be, for example, if you're dealing with a purchaser who is a Muslim, normally they can't receive any interest. Then you would deposit that money, keep it in your trust account. All interest would then go to the law society, to the law society as governed by Section 86(2). But let's say it says that it should be invested for the benefit of the purchaser. Your conveyancer opens the investment account and pays it into that investment account. It then accrues interest over the period that it's invested. Let's say the transaction goes through, he gets his bond, it's not cancelled due to non-compliance of the suspensive condition. It goes the whole way through and it registers. Up until that it registers, all interest that accrues must be paid over to the purchaser. But there's one exception, Zama, to the rule, to say that if it is invested in terms of section 86, 3 and 4, the interest will accrue to the purchaser, but provided that 5% of that interest must be paid over to the Fidelity Fund.
Okay, so I think then so now we're clear that, you know, you've signed your OTP, and then depending on what that OTP says in terms of the deposit, you put it in, let's say it's within the first 7 days or 21 days, you deposit it into the transferring attorney's account. We now know what that account does. How do we know that the attorney is not going to run away with our money? Because I mean, I can imagine, certainly as a new time buyer, you're signing this, or you would have met an estate agent that you found on private property because you're looking for a property, and then you sign an OTP. You don't know the owner, you've never met the owner, you're just seeing documents that are signed, and you take it that that is necessarily the person. And let's, for instances of this example, assume that is in fact the owner, and now you're about to put down a 50,000 rand deposit. This is a lot of money. You've been saving for 2 years. They've given you this bank account, and you're not particularly sure if that's a credible, that's even a lawyer, or rather their attorneys. How do we know that we're paying it to the right attorneys? Because as we're saying, before we went on air, is that oftentimes we've certainly seen instances where attorneys run away with people's money, and people sometimes don't know what to do. But we'll get to what people can do. How are we rest assured that we're essentially paying away this particular money or putting this deposit away with a credible attorney who's not going to run away with our funds?
Yeah. So normally, let's say it is an attorney. In most instances, it has to always be an attorney, but in some instances, people do present themselves as attorney and they're not. So it's very important for the purchaser to, if he does not know the firm, or if anything looks sketchy, anything that he receives from the transferring attorney, he can always ask the transferring attorney for, one, confirmation of their bank account, and two, a copy of the Fidelity Fund certificate issued to the directors of that firm. So again, in terms of the Legal Practitioners Act, the directors need to have a valid Fidelity Fund certificate. So if your purchaser then receives those documents, he can be quite rest assured that firm is actually an attorney firm, and they are adhering to the Legal Practitioners Act. But there is no 100% risk-free that the attorney will not dip his or her fingers into the trust account. It does happen. But as long as your purchaser at least did some homework on the attorneys and asked for these documents, remember, attorneys, because we have the Fidelity Fund, it's an insurance that the attorney has to have. And if we can provide a valid Fidelity Fund certificate, and let's say anything goes wrong, the attorney or the conveyancer does dip into the trust fund or into the investment fund, the purchaser will be able to institute a claim against the insurance to see whether they can get some of that money back.
Marike, we're going to go for a quick break, and when we come back, we'll be taking some of the questions and comments from viewers at home. If you've ever had, any questions around the deposit, what happens to it, how you can ensure that you're sending it to the right people, or perhaps you once paid it and the attorneys ran away with the money. We want to hear your story. When we come back, I'll still be joined by Marike Elhers, who's a conveyancer and a notary public at SSLR Incorporated.